Mom and Ralph both had the flu this last week. Anyone else who has just walked in that needs today or the material from 2 weeks ago? Christina, I assume you probably do. Sarah, are we up? All right, we are. Live stream is going now as well. So, as I indicated, somewhat unexpectedly, and I kind of had to rearrange things to figure out how we were going to conclude. The schedule got changed, and so today is our last day on this subject. As I indicated when we got started, most everything so far has been very, very high level and very introductory. And now is somewhat only more so in that regard. But we left off on the back of the last page of Class 5 last week, 2 weeks ago. And so as a little bit of a refresher, that class's subject was on morality and the problem of evil. Or in other words, if God exists and God is good, why does evil exist? Why does God allow evil, etc.? And so we had wrapped up discussing issues around the conduct of mankind. And of course, you have competing ideas. And as Terry pointed out, we didn't exactly define good, which was somewhat on purpose, because when you're having discussions with folks, what they're going to define as good is something you're going to need to ask them and define, because that's going to kind of guide where the conversation is going to go as far as what defines as good to someone. But most people, at least people that will have been raised in Western civilization, are going to have at least be in the same ballpark for the majority of things that they would consider good or not. And so one of the big questions comes down to, is mankind naturally good or not? And obviously we have a very specific, probably even a little bit more specific than the rest of Christianity, idea of the answer to that question. And so to kind of conclude this, one of the considerations is, well, if what we believe is true, what does an absence of God look like? And so you are probably familiar with the story, the argument that is sometimes attributed to Einstein, although I do believe, as far as historical record goes, that is considered apocryphal. But whether it was Einstein or someone else, there's a student arguing with a professor about God and evil, and the student challenges the professor as to whether or not cold exists, and determines no, cold doesn't really exist, it's simply an absence of heat. Likewise, darkness doesn't exist, it's the absence of light. And then comes to the conclusion along the lines of, evil isn't something that exists or was created by God, it's simply the absence of God. And so as we covered in the beginning of that class, as with good being something that has a very difficult to define meaning without God, evil likewise is something that does not really have a definable meaning beyond the personal or cultural view of evil if you don't have God. There can be no murder is bad in every case, only an I or my family or my culture don't like murder. We may even dislike it enough to institute a punishment for it. And earlier in that class, we had mentioned that the atheist and anti-theist will sometimes claim Christians are only good because they fear what God will do to them if they don't follow him. And that was something, if you may recall, that we dispensed with as an argument because of its flaws. But in the context of there not being a God, there being an absence of God, anyone who lives a quote-unquote good life, cannot really argue to be any more good than someone who lives completely differently, and B, can only compel those who don't agree to their moral framework with fear of punishment. So in other words, we can institute laws for things. We can make certain things illegal. We can allow other things to be legal. We can have an enforcement apparatus in place to regulate the following, or in the cases where it's not followed, what those laws are. But at the end of the day, and this is one thing that you will find in discussions with people without a religious background, is a problem they also often run into, is whether or not something is legal does not equate to whether or not something is moral. And that is a mistake that a lot of people make. So with God, yes, there is a fear of consequence and punishment for evil. But there is also something aspirational. Because we believe God is all good and all knowing, we can have assurance of something to aspire to. I don't not murder because God tells me he'll punish me if I do. I don't murder because I believe by not doing so, I am aspiring to live a life that is better than the alternative. Absent God, there is no such aspiration. Only arguments about whose interpretation of right and wrong is correct, and a danger that the ultimate victor in the argument of what is right and wrong is going to be one that is had by conquest. Because ultimately, without a source beyond ourselves to point to, morality eventually devolves to a might makes right circumstance. Whether that's direct conflict or simply somebody whose culture is simply overbearing. One of the interesting things that I've seen is a claim that we as Americans have no culture, which is kind of goofy if you think about it for more than 5 seconds. And one of the issues is that at least certain aspects of American culture have become so ubiquitous throughout the world, it's not really recognized as being American in origin. Coke and blue jeans are two really easy examples. They have become so ubiquitous around the world that the origins are not really clearly understood or recognized. So you can have a more peaceful given moral order that establishes itself simply because a given culture is more successful in ways other than warfare. But those are ultimately the only ways in which you can have any sort of moral system assert itself outside of God. And that's really kind of the situation that we have found ourselves in. We mentioned in some previous classes the degree to which modern culture and modern views on morality and ethics are so deeply entrenched and dependent on some 2,000 years of growing Christian history in the West that people take completely for granted that our culture is the way that it is and that we consider the things that we consider to be immoral. So a couple of other subjects that come up, and I did not take the time to just spell out all of these for the purposes of that class 2 weeks ago, but also apply in this question of morals, is your conscience. And by that, we're talking about why it feels wrong to do certain things. That has very shaky framework as far as explaining it, absent the explanation that we are all born into the world with a portion of the Lord's Spirit that tries to entice us towards what is right. Another one is common tenets across religion. One of the common ones, even Islam has this, is care for the poor. Where has this idea come from? There's a lot of consideration in the modern day about the uprising of the poor and the oppressed. We've had communist regimes pop up around that subject over the last 100 years. But why is it that that's an idea that's actually going back thousands of years, back to a time where mankind tended to be much more tribal in its nature? Another one, and this was something that came up in the course of the philosophy classes that I took, one of my professors pointed out that when it comes to certain ideas, as far as where they originated on a map, most philosophy underlying either civic philosophy, scientific philosophy, which is a little bit of a misnomer because at least as we use the word science today is something that only goes back about 400 years. But whether you're talking morality, the nature of the universe, etc., all those various philosophies, many of which became their own disciplines like science and mathematics, when it comes to laying those out on a map and tracing the origins of those ideas, they seem to head back to a single place, which is not an idea that comports with most of anthropology's idea about the origin and history of human peoples, but it is something that comports with what the Bible tells us as far as where people have been and eventually spread and scattered. Another issue in this subject, and it's kind of the inverse of what I've mentioned of how steeped we are in a culture that's had 2,000 years of Christian influence, is what happens in a civilization that truly rejects God. Some of you will have heard me talk about before the German philosopher Nietzsche, and he is frequently used and cited as a pro-atheist sort of individual, and he seemingly was mostly atheistic. However, he was very much consumed by the concern of what are we going to replace God with? If we don't replace God with something effective, this is going to be a catastrophe. And his philosophy, coming in the 19th century, foretold much of the destruction that eventually came in the 20th century between fascism and communism. And while it has become germane for atheists to claim that Hitler's regime was a Christian regime, I am not aware of any decent scholars that take that seriously. Hitler was very much a pagan individual who simply still used some of the iconography and trappings of Christianity because he was in a primarily Christian nation and was trying to head in another direction. Then there's lastly the issue that if no God exists, everything is permissible. Go back to, I forget whether it was earlier in this class or if it was one of the previous classes, when I mentioned the fact that Genghis Khan's his descendants represent 0.5% of all males on Earth. When it comes to a purely biological success perspective, that man is arguably the most successful and effective human who has ever lived. But I don't think any of us would consider the life he lived and the things that he did things that we would accept or wish to emulate. But if there is no God, on what basis do you state that his approach to things was wrong or worse than something else? The humanists have been struggling with this ever since the end of the Second World War. They still haven't figured it out. Now that is not to fall into the trap that it is impossible to figure out, although I do personally am of the opinion that yes, it will prove impossible to figure out because you have no framework that you can point to. So any questions or thoughts there on our fifth class before we kind of head into an overall conclusion and some other things to consider down the road? Matt?
It's really just a little statement. We were talking about good and stuff, and I seen me and my wife went to lunch yesterday, and there was a lady wearing a sweatshirt that had this saying on it: "Can you spell good without God?" And you think about it, good is God with an extra O. I just thought that was very interesting how they fit together.
Yeah, we didn't get into it here because it's a bit more, at least I would characterize it as a bit more as theology than apologetics. But yes, there is, of course, in Christian theology, Christ presents that question to Nicodemus, I believe: "Why callest thou me good?" When Nicodemus comes to him and says, "Good master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And I've commented before in other settings that just because of how language has evolved and gets used on a daily basis, I do not think that the word good remotely means anymore what it meant when the King James Bible was written. What was that? Was that the 1600s? Early 1600s, I think that was put together, some 400 years ago. That is a word that I think has changed significantly in meaning, and that goes to the heart of some of the issues that you find yourself presented with when you were having these kinds of conversations with other people. Is can you agree to what your terms even mean? And admittedly, some people, including people on the Christian side of the apologetics discussions, will kind of use definitions deceptively and turn it into a word salad minefield where no effective discussion can be had. And that needs to be something that we are kind of wary of. I guess before we get into the conclusion section, what I had originally intended the final class or couple of classes would be kind of a Q&A type setting. And if we run over, you have everything written down for your own reading later. So I think instead what I'd rather spend a little time on is if there is anything anyone has specific questions on over what we have covered in this class, or even perhaps some questions you've encountered that we haven't touched on yet. Or is it still too early in the morning for everyone? Terry? You're always good for trying to stump me.
I think the biggest question I always have is, where do you start the conversation? What question do you ask your opponent? Where do we start? What do we think about? What basis do we begin this discussion? Can we even begin this discussion without getting into a fisticuffs? Because oftentimes, it does cause a lot of emotional response in people, and that's really the problem, is that it does cause emotional response. And we can't just logically approach and say, okay, what is good? Well, good is when I don't punch you. Good is when I try to take care of my brother, which you've already alluded to. Good is this, or good is that. But if we were going to use this as missionary tools, the biggest question, again, that I have is, where do you start? What question do you ask first? I know where I start, but what do we think? And this is probably where we need to be able to work on the most. This needs to be, as a missionary tool, maybe a year-long theological doctrinal course, so that we can get together and practice and consider, what am I hearing, and how do I respond to what I hear, and where do we go from there?
Yeah, so I would kind of characterize your question as mostly falling in the category of rhetoric. So there's a couple of, there are basically three large categories that I would say any sort of missionary or proselytizing effort is falling into. And that's rhetoric, theology, and apologetics. So the theology is simply what we believe. The apologetics is the answer to the counter arguments that are had against us. And the rhetoric is simply how you go about expressing your thoughts, engaging with people. So admittedly, I had not thought terribly deeply about rhetoric specifically, at least not yet, as far as preparing this class. It probably would have been something I would have given a bit more consideration to towards the end of the original schedule. I know, how many of you are familiar with Pascal's wager? I see a couple of hands. So Pascal, as in the mathematician, geometrician, I forget which branch he was involved. I think it was geometry primarily, because isn't there a Pascal's triangle or something like that? But he had made the argument, and admittedly it does have some weaknesses, but I think it can be an effective question to start with. He had made one of those 2x2 diagrams, and on the top is God exists, yes or no, I believe, yes or no, and then you have your results in your little 2x2 grid. So if God does exist and I do believe, I win everything. If God doesn't exist and I do believe, I lose nothing. If God does exist and I don't believe, I lose everything. And if I don't believe and God doesn't exist, I lose nothing. So you have two nothing to lose outcomes. You have a one lose everything outcome. You have one gain everything outcome. So he argued that the rational approach was belief. So I wouldn't necessarily give that specific example because that admittedly does have some weaknesses. The immediate question almost any non-believer is going to ask, okay, there's 50,000 some odd religions. Which one is it I'm supposed to believe according to this wager? And so that is, a little bit of a stumbling block to that example, but especially in today's day and age, one of the first questions, depending on the temperament and the perspective of the individual I am discussing with, one of the first questions I would be asking is, what do you think comes of belief, and what do you think comes of a lack of belief? Because as we've covered a little bit, and again, this has been a very high level, and as Terry indicated, this could easily be year-long, deep theology, apologetics type class, is what things look like in a world absent Christian belief. And I think with each passing day, that is becoming more and more clearly defined. Richard Dawkins is perhaps one of the most famous atheists, and I would also categorize him as an anti-theist, that there is. But in recent years, in observing what has been happening in the UK, he has begun to acknowledge that perhaps Christianity, even though he still doesn't believe in it, was worthwhile as a bulwark against something worse, because he's watching what is happening in the UK, particularly at the hands of Islam. Terry, go ahead.
My mind is going all over the place. I have a book in case anybody would really like to, and I know the book is still available. It's called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," because it talks a lot about the holes in their thinking patterns. And in order for us to really, the subject matter is so huge that I don't know that we can just say, is there a God, is there not a God? Because, man, you can go on and, sometimes you end up with the argument, well, I can't physically prove it. I can't knock on God's shoulder and say, that's God with it. But there are a lot of holes in their thinking. And one of the things that I do like to point out to people I'm having discussions with is so much of what they claim as fact isn't in reality fact, it's a theory. And it's being taught as a fact, but they don't have any validity to their thinking pattern. I have science books at the house too that are quite thick and quite intense that really try to present the new earth theory. And is it possible, for example? Well, if you start looking at all the scientific data that's out there, even to the age the way we date, carbon dating, I couldn't think of it. You look at carbon dating can be fallible in many ways. So how is anything in anybody's discussion concrete? So I think one of the ways that I would approach this would be, let's break this down into little tiny pieces and see what we really think is true and what's not true as far as reality goes. And the question is, yeah, I think if we look around the communities that we have today, we don't have to go very far. We can go next door, we can watch TV, whatever. We can see that God is no longer a part of our thinking pattern, and God is being left out of the pattern. Therefore, it gets back to, well, mankind can just solve its own issues, because basically we don't want to harm each other. We want to try to do, quote unquote, good things to each other, or have a good life, whatever that definition may be. So break it down, break it down into small pieces and make it easier to have a discussion.
Well, I would still contend and give the example, even to the last point that you raised, is like that is still entirely contextual on what culture you're talking about. Go look at Putin and Xi Jinping. You're not going to find that they agree to that. Well, let's not harm one another. It's like that generally that attitude you will not find going outside a nation and a culture. Even today, even with the existence of nuclear weapons, the horrors of the 20th century, you still find that mankind is willing to flirt with very, very terrible things. And so yeah, no, I
don't think Donald Trump ought to either.
yeah. It comes back to that question that we raised at the beginning of Class 5, on what level are you applying truth? And if you can't commit to universal truth, which requires the existence of God, you've got a real big problem. What are you going to do? And the answer ultimately is, no matter your opinion on harming others, the answer ultimately is you got to be armed to the teeth. Because the instant somebody comes along that does not share that idea of not harming others, if you're not prepared for it, you're wiped out. Terry, go ahead.
I was laying, as I was waking up this morning, thinking, why do I believe in God? What is my testimony? And sometimes I think maybe that's all we can do in these scenarios is, this is my testimony. I believe in God because, for me, it's very difficult to look around, even around the world, my backyard, look at the plants, the order of things, for example, when that's where you start breaking things down a little bit. Let's take a look at one aspect. I believe in God because it seems to me that the order of the universe, the order of a flower, the order of a baby, the order of whatever you're using as your example is so incredible that it couldn't just come by chance.
Yes.
I mean, that's just one of my, why do I believe in God? Why do I come and worship? Is it habit? Is it tradition? I'm here because I believe. I'm here because I want to learn. I'm here because I want to praise God for all that he has done. And that's my testimony. And if you don't like my testimony, you're free to do whatever you think the way you want to think. But give me the right to also think the way I think. And sometimes we end up, they don't want to give us the right to think the way we think either.
No, and that gets into levels of philosophy and politics that go somewhat outside the scope of this class, issues of postmodernism and the post-World War II order and things of that nature. And yeah, that is an issue that has to be contended with. And so you kind of already presaged some of what I had in my conclusion with some of your initial comments. So I'll just skip to that next to last paragraph on the back of your page. Like, broaching these subjects may and probably will be contentious depending on who the conversation is with. But as a reminder, if we actually believe what we profess to believe, we have to start finding the spine to do this, and we need to know when to look for help. Shouldn't need saying, but we should first and foremost always be seeking the Lord's aid through a solid prayer life coupled with a study of the Word. You can't advocate for what you don't know. But we also need to be willing to go find someone to help answer questions, and we need to be willing to learn more. Like most things we discuss and learn in classes and sermon, it doesn't end here today. This is just a primer, and the ball is now in each individual's court to take from there. And another thing that Terry said, if you flip back to the front of that page, so I listed out here a couple of topics for further study, just to kind of give you an idea of both some of the places the class would have been going, as well as some things you can look into on your own time to get better acquainted. History of the Scriptures is a big one. Manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, origin of the Old and New Testaments, things of that nature is what I'm talking about when I say history of the Scriptures. So one thing to note, and this is like the highest of nosebleed overviews to this, but if the Scripture as records and the manuscripts that have gone to produce what we have today as the Bible, if those records are cast into serious doubt, then every record of the ancient world prior to the advent of the printing press is suspect, and more suspect than the Bible. In other words, if the Bible is not reliable as at least historical record, there is no reliable history of the world before the printing press. And a lot of people, Brother Eddie sent me something a few days ago, and it was kind of a long story, and it was a man who had been at some sort of meeting, and I think it was his pastor, was lamenting the fact that his now 18 or 19-year-old son, who had just gone off to college, had declared he didn't believe. And that was, some of the questions that came up in the course of the conversation that pastor had left this father kind of concerned, because he had, I believe it was about an 11-year-old son at the time, and he realized that a lot of the issues that had come up and what the pastor related was around questions of why. And so he went home and started asking his son questions, and the son was able to give the who's, the what's, the when's, the where's, but was not able to give a lot of the why behind the gospel. And so the father kind of got to be a little bit panicked that his son lacked a why. One of the issues that frequently comes up that attempts to undermine people is around the question of, is the Bible a reliable document just as history? Never mind the spiritual stuff. Just as history, is it even reliable? And there is a lot of bad information out there. And, the sad fact of the matter, the average atheist is better studied on the Bible than the average Christian is. This is somewhat buried in this paragraph here, but I'll just touch on it, independently without reading everything through. There is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a term in psychology that describes the relationship that is seen between an individual's confidence in their knowledge and the knowledge they actually possess. And the graph looks like a giant U. So in other words, just a little bit of knowledge on a subject, people have complete and utter confidence in what they know. Then as they start to learn things, that confidence bottoms out, and then as you start to get into the realm of being an actual expert on the subject, confidence starts going back up. I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but from what I have observed, the stories that I have heard, and you can take this as just being purely anecdotal and dismiss it if you wish, but the average Christian, perhaps even the average member of this church, is sitting down at that bottom end. They are very confident, but they know next to nothing. And the problem is when people go and get into the world and start to run into somebody who knows a little bit more and so starts expressing more doubts, that confidence goes away and new atheist is born. Or at least somebody who's agnostic. So another thing to keep in mind, that this gets particular to the restoration as far as the subject of apologetics goes, is the nature and value of continuing revelation. Why did God speak then and not now? How can we know something given to men thousands of years ago still holds true? How do we clear confusion for a time in historical context that something was given that may no longer be understandable? I know that we have a fair bit of history and information about what the ancient Israelites were like, probably more so than we have about most other civilizations of similar age. That still doesn't guarantee us that we know exactly the context of everything that was going on at the time. And so how does Scripture remain reliable? And that is something that the rest of Christianity has a much bigger weakness for than we do. One thing, for Christianity, there's the problem of evil, but I will say there's a reverse problem for atheism, and that's the problem of the devil. And we kind of alluded to that in about the middle of the previous class. It's like, how does an active opposition to God and his followers change the discussion? And then Terry kind of touched on this as well. There's questions of standards of evidence, and this is another area that you'll have to kind of talk with people when you're talking with them to kind of get an idea of where they're at, what they're holding to. And this is where, as Terry was alluding to, if you examine it a little bit, a lot of the underlying logic, and I use logic in air quotes in this regard, falls apart because much of disbelief of the gospel is rooted in kind of a that evidence isn't good enough argument. Our personal testimony, I remember, for anyone who doesn't know, I had an experience at it would have been, I think, about 12. It was second junior high camp for me, so I'm pretty certain that would make me about 12. I had an experience of that camp of seeing Christ and feeling his hands placed on my shoulders. I have a very definitive testimony that that is true. And that is something that I have on occasion shared with non-believers throughout my life. And it is particularly in high school when I was getting, I guess to put it politely, needled over my religious belief. That was one of the things that I fell back to. And the level of mockery and second guessing that I got was not something that I was really prepared for. I was I was expecting skepticism, but I was not necessarily expecting a whole lot of outright ridicule. And there was a lot of whataboutism. Well, how do you know it wasn't XYZ, from hallucination to a trick of the smoke of the campfire, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, basically every excuse to not believe my testimony that one could come up with was offered. And in those kind of scenarios, there's probably not going to be a convincing of that individual. But it comes back to the question for the non-believers. What do you do? Because I am by no means the only person living today or throughout history that has had that kind of testimony of the reality of the existence of Christ. You had, recorded in the scriptures, what was it, 500 witnesses who saw him post-resurrection? So you have that issue of what do you do? What side of the equation does one fall on as to whether or not that constitutes good enough evidence or not? And the thing is, many of the criticisms that will be leveled towards that sort of evidence, if you take that same level of criticism towards atheist beliefs, their beliefs fall apart too. Because you reach a point where the absoluteness of the evidence that is being sought is literally unattainable, barring God appearing right in front of them. And especially, and again, this is a strength for the restoration from a theological perspective. I think probably most of you will recall at least twice that something to that kind of effect happened in the Book of Mormon. and did not end well for the individuals that were insisting upon that kind of level of sign. And we have contained within Scripture an admonishment against seeking those sort of signs, the indication that that is A, a tempting of the Lord, and B, not the way the Lord works. At the end of the day, that term of wager, for Pascal's wager, is kind of correct. I hesitate to use the word gamble because it's not the right word, but I think you probably know what I mean by that. It's like, it's still an element of faith. That is a requirement within the theology, is there's an element of faith. Going from this life with absolute knowledge was never something that was promised or guaranteed. So it becomes a question of, where do you want to be, both in this life and in the hereafter, if it exists? I have made the comment before, and it is something that I do stand by to this day, that if one can get past the hurdle of at least having faith that God is and that he exists, that everything else about the restoration follows logically and is completely defensible by simple argumentation. But there is still that initial act of faith that is going to be required. There is nothing that is going to supersede that. And if you dive into philosophy, Eddie mentioned a few weeks ago, I believe it was Hume, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. He is a philosopher. That was as far as he could get for what he could be certain about. He couldn't be certain about anything beyond his own senses. I mean, I have, as a result of those classes, I have occasionally been heard to make the joke that, as far as I know, you're all figments of my imagination. I'm the only one that exists. And as far as what I can definitively prove, that is as far as it goes. In fact, some philosophers even deconstructed it further and said, well, no, I can't say I am because I think. The most I can say is I think, therefore, at least thinking exists, but I don't know that I exist. So all of these things come back to that question of, what are you going to take as good enough evidence for the things that you believe? And at the end of the day, everybody takes things on faith far more than they believe that they do. We're just about up against the hour here, but any final questions or thoughts before we conclude here? I know as quickly as we've gone through this stuff, I've probably made everything about as clear as mud. All righty, well, I appreciate your time and your consideration, and if there's, both for you, those of you in the room, those of you on the live stream, if there's anything that you would like to ask more or discuss more on when it comes to these subjects, I'm more than happy to participate in such discussion. I do not promise that I have all the answers. Within these various subjects of apologetics, there are people that dedicate entire careers to just singular aspects, like the history of the scriptures. So for the use of maybe hunting around a little on your own online, when it comes to some of those sort of things, I would recommend Wes Huff as one of the folks who is quite knowledgeable on that. When it comes to kind of the more philosophical stuff that we touched on early on, William Lane Craig has done a lot on that in both books that he has written, as well as arguments and discussions that he has participated in. There is quite a bit that you can find out there. The early internet was kind of a major boon to atheists because they were a little less common and were able to band together because of the internet. But the interesting thing is, over the last 10 years especially, at least as far as I've noticed, that's kind of started to swing in the other direction, which is somewhat reassuring, that despite where the world is headed, that there are still perhaps those that are still being prepared for receiving of greater truths. But I hope this has been helpful to everyone. And I'll close with one final thing from towards the end. So, as we've already discussed, part of this class was around making us better missionaries. But it does go a lot deeper than that. We can be the most effective missionaries in the world, but if we cannot keep those who are already in the faith firm in their foundations, there's not going to be any growth. Current membership will fade away, and new membership is going to quickly conclude there's nothing worth staying for if they see everyone else fading away. We have a solid cadre of kids who are in the elementary to early high school range. How many of them are being taught the why as opposed to the who, what, where, and when? How many of them are still going to be believers a decade into being an adult? That is a very serious question that I think we all need to ponder. And as we've been directed in Revelation probably about a decade ago, all of us have a responsibility for those generations that are coming after us to see that they are firm in the faith, both in their understanding of the theology and the apologetics, but also in their understanding of the testimonies that we have. Because I'll tell you right now, the people who were most instrumental in my life, with only one or two exceptions, they're already dead. I don't mean this as an insult or a slight to anyone. I am not here because of the influence any of you have had in my life. I'm here because of the testimony I was given. And I feel very confident I would not be without that testimony with the things that I have faced in my life. I hope that all of us will be better about the generation that is coming up than were with my generation or my parents' generation, or there's not going to be anything left in a few years. A sobering note, but I think a necessary one.